Hello, my best students, and welcome again to your channel, Native Flow. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most fascinating, visionary, and controversial people in modern history, Steve Jobs, the man who helped transform technology, phones, music, computers, animation, and even the way human beings interact with technology itself. But honestly, this is not only the story of a billionaire, it is the story of obsession, creativity, failure, rejection, perfectionism, and the dangerous intensity of someone who refused to think normally. Because Steve Jobs was not simply a businessman, he was a storyteller, a marketer, a visionary, a perfectionist, and sometimes a very difficult human being. Many people today look at Apple and see success, but behind that success, there were years of confusion, mistakes, pressure, risk, and emotional struggle. Steve Jobs was fired from the company he created. He experienced public humiliation. He doubted himself. He failed repeatedly. And yet, those painful moments eventually helped shape some of the biggest innovations in modern technology. And honestly, that is why his story became so powerful, because it is not a perfect success story. It is a story about creativity mixed with chaos, confidence mixed with fear, vision mixed with obsession. And in this episode, you will discover how Steve Jobs started from almost nothing, how Apple was created, why he was fired from his own company, how he returned stronger, how the iPhone changed the world forever, and why his mindset still influences modern business and technology today. And while listening, you will also improve your English naturally through storytelling, business vocabulary, technology vocabulary, listening practice, and deep comprehension. So, relax. Listen carefully. And let's begin with chapter number 1. How a curious young man helped create one of the most valuable companies in human history. Before we start, if you're tired of understanding English but still struggling to speak it confidently, listen carefully. I created something very special for you. The Real English Fluency Pack is a complete English fluency system designed to help you improve your grammar, vocabulary, conversations, phrasal verbs, listening, and speaking confidence step by step in a simple and practical way. This is not boring textbook English. Everything inside was created to help you finally speak naturally and understand real English in daily life. And after joining, you'll also get exclusive WhatsApp contact with me, access to our private English WhatsApp community, future books, audiobooks, bonus resources, and continuous updates to keep improving together. So if you truly want to stop feeling stuck and finally take your English to the next level, the link is waiting for you in the description. Chapter number 1. How Steve Jobs started Apple in a garage. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco, California. But honestly, his life began with uncertainty from the very beginning. He was adopted shortly after birth by a working-class couple named Paul and Clara Jobs. His family was not rich. They lived a simple life. But one thing deeply influenced young Steve very early: curiosity, especially curiosity about technology. His father loved working with tools and electronics in the garage, and little by little, Steve became fascinated by how things were built, how machines worked, how small details mattered. And honestly, this obsession with detail would later become one of the biggest parts of his personality. Now here's something interesting. Steve Jobs was intelligent. But he was also rebellious. He disliked traditional school systems. He questioned authority constantly, and many teachers found him difficult to control. But psychologically, this tells us something important about creative personalities. Highly creative people often struggle inside rigid systems because their brain naturally pushes toward experimentation, questioning, and independence. And Steve Jobs was exactly like that. Now, during his teenage years, he met someone who would completely change his future, Steve Wozniak, usually called Woz. Wozniak was a brilliant engineer, quiet, technical, extremely skilled with electronics, and honestly, the partnership between Jobs and Wozniak became legendary because their personalities were completely different. Wozniak loved building technology. Jobs loved imagining how technology could change people's lives. One created, the other envisioned. And together, they became extremely powerful. Now let's talk about the beginning of Apple. At that time, computers were very different from today. They were huge, complicated, expensive. Most ordinary people never imagined having a personal computer at home. Technology felt distant and technical, but Steve Jobs saw something others ignored. He believed computers could become personal, simple, beautiful, useful for ordinary people. And honestly, this idea sounded crazy to many people back then. Now, in 1976, Jobs and Wozniak officially created Apple Computer. And yes, the company famously started in a garage. This story became one of the biggest symbols of startup culture in modern history. Two young men building technology from almost nothing. Now, here's something extremely important. At the beginning, Apple was not successful because they had massive money or powerful connections. They succeeded because they believed in a vision nobody else fully understood yet. That matters psychologically, because many revolutionary ideas sound unrealistic before they become normal. Now their first major product was the Apple I computer. It was simple compared to modern devices, but revolutionary for its time. Soon afterward, Apple released the Apple II, and this changed everything. The Apple II became one of the first highly successful personal computers in history. Sales exploded. The company grew rapidly, and suddenly, Steve Jobs became one of the most talked about young entrepreneurs in America. Now, here's something fascinating about Jobs psychologically. He was obsessed with user experience. Most technology companies focused only on technical performance, but Jobs cared deeply about design, simplicity, emotion, beauty, and how people felt while using technology. This became one of Apple's biggest advantages. He believed technology should feel human, easy, elegant, almost emotional. And honestly, that philosophy changed the technology industry forever. Now let's talk about another important part of his personality. Steve Jobs was extremely demanding, sometimes painfully demanding. He pushed employees intensely. He wanted perfection constantly. Many people admired him. Many others found him difficult, exhausting, or even harsh. And honestly, both things were true. Jobs had incredible vision, but also very complicated leadership behavior. Now, here's another important truth. Success arrived very quickly for Apple, and psychologically, rapid success can become dangerous because when companies grow fast, pressure increases, ego increases, conflict increases, and soon, internal tensions started appearing inside Apple itself, especially between Steve Jobs and other executives. Now, despite Apple's massive growth, many people inside the company began struggling with Jobs' personality and leadership style. He pushed too hard, changed ideas suddenly, expected impossible standards sometimes, and slowly, serious conflict began building internally. But nobody imagined what would happen next, because eventually, Steve Jobs would experience one of the most shocking moments of his life. He would be removed from Apple, the company he helped create himself. And honestly, that painful experience would completely transform him emotionally and professionally. Chapter number 2, the day Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. At the beginning, Steve Jobs believed Apple would continue growing forever under his leadership. The company was becoming famous, money was increasing. Apple employees felt they were changing the future of technology. And honestly, for a young man in his 20s, this level of success was overwhelming. But behind the scenes, serious problems were growing inside the company. Now listen carefully, because this part of Steve Jobs' story is extremely important psychologically. Success does not automatically create emotional maturity, and sometimes people who are brilliant creatively still struggle deeply with leadership, communication, and emotional balance. Steve Jobs was a visionary. Nobody doubted that. But managing a huge company requires more than vision. It also requires stability, teamwork, patience, organization, and emotional intelligence. And honestly, Jobs struggled with many of these things during his early years at Apple. Now, one of Apple's biggest projects during the 1980s was the Macintosh computer. Steve Jobs became obsessed with it. He wanted the Macintosh to completely revolutionize personal computing. And in many ways, it did. The Macintosh introduced ideas that later became standard: graphical interfaces, icons, mouse navigation, beautiful typography, user-friendly interaction. Jobs wanted technology to feel simple and elegant for ordinary people. That vision was revolutionary. But the project also created enormous internal pressure. Jobs pushed employees extremely hard. Sometimes he demanded impossible deadlines. Sometimes he rejected work repeatedly until it matched his standards. Many employees admired his brilliance, but others felt emotionally exhausted working around him. Now, here's something very important psychologically. Perfectionism can create both greatness and destruction at the same time. And Steve Jobs represented this contradiction perfectly. His obsession with perfection helped create beautiful products, but it also created conflict, stress, and tension inside the company. Now, eventually, Apple executives became increasingly worried about Jobs' leadership style. The company was growing larger. Investors wanted stability, and some leaders believed Steve Jobs was becoming too emotionally unpredictable. At the same time, competition in the computer industry was increasing rapidly. Apple faced pressure financially, and internal disagreements became more serious. Now something fascinating happened here. Steve Jobs himself helped recruit a powerful executive named John Scully from Pepsi. Jobs famously asked him, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world?" That sentence became legendary, and honestly, it perfectly represented Steve Jobs' personality. Visionary, emotional, intense. At first, Jobs believed Scully would become a strong partner, but slowly, their relationship became complicated. Disagreements increased, power struggles developed, and eventually, Apple's board of directors had to choose who would control the company: Steve Jobs or John Sculley. And shockingly, the board supported Sculley. In 1985, Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple, the company he helped create. Imagine that emotionally for a moment. The company you built, the dream you sacrificed for, the identity connected to your entire life, suddenly rejecting you publicly. And honestly, this moment deeply destroyed Steve Jobs emotionally. Later, he described it as one of the most painful experiences of his life. He felt humiliated, lost, confused. For a while, he did not know what to do next. Now, psychologically, this moment is extremely important because many people build their entire identity around one success, one career, one dream. And when that collapses, they collapse internally too. Steve Jobs experienced exactly this type of identity crisis. And honestly, many people expected him to disappear after that. But something surprising happened. After the emotional pain slowly settled, Steve Jobs started rebuilding himself, and this became one of the most important turning points of his entire life, because sometimes failure forces people to grow emotionally in ways success never could. Now, instead of quitting completely, Jobs started new projects. One of them was a new technology company called Next. The company focused on advanced computers for education and business. Financially, Next was not a huge success initially, but technologically, it developed important innovations. And interestingly, those technologies would later become extremely important for Apple itself. Now, here's another fascinating part of the story. During this same period, Steve Jobs also bought a small animation company from Lucasfilm. That company later became Pixar. At the time, very few people imagined animation could become a massive digital business. But once again, Jobs saw potential others underestimated. And eventually, Pixar created one of the most successful animated movies in history, Toy Story. This transformed Pixar completely, and suddenly, Steve Jobs was becoming successful again outside Apple. Now, here's something very powerful psychologically. Being fired from Apple forced Jobs to evolve. He became more mature, more reflective, more patient strategically. The pain changed him. And honestly, sometimes painful experiences become hidden preparation for future greatness, because Steve Jobs would eventually return to Apple. And when he returned, he would completely transform not only the company, but the entire technology industry forever. Chapter number 3, How Steve Jobs Returned and Changed Technology Forever. By the mid-1990s, Apple was struggling badly. The company that once helped revolutionize personal computers was now losing direction. Sales were falling, products felt confusing, competition was growing rapidly, and honestly, many people believed Apple might completely collapse. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs was no longer the same young man who had been fired years earlier. The painful experiences after leaving Apple changed him deeply. He had learned patience, strategy, leadership, and the importance of focus. And honestly, sometimes failure teaches lessons success never can. Now something very interesting happened. Apple needed better software technology urgently. And the company Next, the company Jobs created after leaving Apple, had exactly the kind of advanced software Apple needed. So in 1997, Apple bought Next. And suddenly, Steve Jobs returned to Apple again. The company that once rejected him was now asking for his help. And honestly, this became one of the greatest comeback stories in business history. Now, when Jobs returned, Apple was chaotic internally. Too many products, too much confusion, no clear direction. So Steve Jobs made one of the most important decisions of his career. He simplified everything. Instead of creating many average products, he wanted Apple to focus on creating a few exceptional ones. This philosophy became central to Apple's future. Focus, simplicity, quality. Now here's something fascinating psychologically. Most companies fear removing products. They fear saying no. But Steve Jobs believed clarity creates power. And honestly, this idea became one of Apple's biggest strengths. Now, during this period, Apple introduced a colorful computer called the iMac. The design looked modern, friendly, and completely different from traditional computers at the time, and people loved it. The iMac helped revive Apple financially and emotionally. Suddenly, the company felt innovative again, exciting again, alive again. But honestly, this was only the beginning, because Steve Jobs was preparing something much bigger. Now let's talk about one of the most important moments in modern technology history, the iPod. Before the iPod, listening to digital music was often frustrating. Devices were complicated, storage was limited, user experience felt uncomfortable, but Steve Jobs once again focused on simplicity and emotional experience. The iPod was elegant, easy to use, beautifully designed, and paired with iTunes. It completely changed how people consumed music. Suddenly, millions of songs could fit inside a small device, and Apple's popularity exploded globally. Now, here's something extremely important. Steve Jobs understood something many companies ignored. People do not only buy technology for functionality, they buy experience, emotion, identity, lifestyle. That insight transformed Apple into much more than a technology company. It became a brand people emotionally connected with. Now let's move to the biggest revolution of all, the iPhone. In 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and introduced a product that would completely reshape modern life. The smartphone already existed in different forms before the iPhone, but most phones felt technical and limited. The iPhone changed everything. Touchscreen interaction, simple design, internet access, apps, music, communication, photography, all combined into one elegant device. And honestly, the world changed after that moment. Today, it is difficult to imagine daily life without smartphones. The way people communicate, work, learn, travel, shop, watch content, build businesses, and interact socially, all transformed because of smartphone technology. And the iPhone played a massive role in that transformation. Now, here's something fascinating psychologically. Steve Jobs understood human behavior extremely well. He knew people wanted technology that felt simple, beautiful, intuitive, and emotional. This is why Apple products often felt different from competitors. They were not only functional, they felt personal. Now, during these years, Apple became one of the most powerful companies in the world. Steve Jobs transformed from controversial entrepreneur into global icon. People admired his vision, presentation style, marketing genius, product philosophy, and obsession with innovation. But behind the scenes, his health was becoming increasingly serious. In 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with cancer. At first, he continued working intensely despite health problems, but over time, his condition worsened. Still, he remained deeply involved in Apple's future, and honestly, many people noticed something emotional during his final years. Steve Jobs became more reflective, more philosophical. He often spoke about time, mortality, purpose, creativity, and meaningful work. One of his most famous speeches was at Stanford University in 2005. There, he said something that touched millions of people around the world. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. That sentence became legendary because it reflected his entire philosophy: boldness, creativity, risk, individual thinking. Now, eventually, his health became too weak to continue leading Apple fully. And in 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The world reacted emotionally because whether people loved him or criticized him, almost everyone agreed on one thing: he changed the modern world permanently. Chapter number 4. The legacy of Steve Jobs and why his mindset still influences the world today. After Steve Jobs passed away in 2011, people around the world began reflecting on something important. How could one person influence so many industries at the same time? Computers, phones, music, animation, design, marketing, communication. And honestly, the answer was not only technology, it was mindset. Because Steve Jobs did not think like a normal businessman. He thought like someone obsessed with possibility. Now, here's something fascinating psychologically. Jobs believed innovation often comes from connecting different worlds together: technology plus design, business plus storytelling, engineering plus emotion. And honestly, this way of thinking changed modern product design forever. Before Apple's rise, many technology companies focused mainly on technical power. Steve Jobs focused on human experience. He constantly asked, "How does this feel for the user? Is this simple enough? Is this beautiful enough? Would people emotionally connect with this?" That mindset became revolutionary. And today, many modern companies still follow the same philosophy. Now let's talk about presentations for a moment. Steve Jobs transformed product launches into emotional storytelling events. Before him, many business presentations felt technical and boring. But Jobs understood something powerful. Human beings remember emotion more than information. So when Apple introduced products, it felt theatrical, exciting, personal. He simplified complex technology into emotional narratives people could understand easily. And honestly, modern marketing changed dramatically because of this approach. Today, many creators, entrepreneurs, YouTubers, and online brands still use storytelling strategies inspired by Jobs' communication style. Now, here's another important truth. Steve Jobs also showed the world the power of focus. This matters psychologically. Many people try to improve everything at once. Too many goals, too many projects, too much distraction. But Jobs believed great companies often succeed by focusing intensely on a few things done exceptionally well. And honestly, this lesson applies far beyond business. It applies to learning English, building habits, content creation, online business, personal growth. Focus creates depth, and depth often creates excellence. Now let's talk about perfectionism again. Steve Jobs' perfectionism helped create extraordinary products, but it also created emotional difficulty for many people around him. This is important to understand honestly, because highly driven personalities sometimes create both inspiration and pressure simultaneously. And honestly, Steve Jobs was deeply human in this way: brilliant, visionary, creative, but also imperfect, sometimes impatient, sometimes emotionally intense, sometimes extremely difficult. And this complexity makes his story more real. Because many people imagine successful individuals as perfect heroes. But real human beings are more complicated than that. Now, here's something beautiful about his legacy. Steve Jobs inspired millions of people to think differently about creativity itself, to believe ideas matter, to believe design matters, to believe technology can feel human, to believe small teams can change massive industries, and psychologically, that inspiration influenced an entire generation of entrepreneurs and creators. Now think about today's digital world. Modern smartphones, apps, touchscreen design, digital ecosystems, content creation, mobile businesses. So much of modern life was shaped directly or indirectly by Apple's innovations. And honestly, that influence is difficult to fully measure. Now let's talk about one final important lesson from Steve Jobs' life. Failure did not destroy him permanently. Being fired from Apple became one of the most painful experiences of his life. But years later, he admitted something surprising. He said being fired actually helped free him creatively, because it forced him to start again with beginner energy. That perspective is powerful psychologically. Sometimes, the moments that initially feel like destruction later become transformation. Now, of course, not every setback automatically becomes success. But Steve Jobs' story reminds people of something important. Failure is not always final. Sometimes it becomes preparation. Now, before we finish this episode, I want you to think about something deeply. Steve Jobs did not change the world because he was perfect. He changed the world because he believed deeply in creativity, vision, simplicity, and possibility. He stayed curious, obsessive, bold, and even after humiliation and failure, he continued creating. That persistence changed history. And honestly, that may be one of the most powerful lessons from his entire life. Not only think differently, but also continue creating even after difficult moments. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Native Flow for more deep English learning podcasts about famous people, psychology, business, technology, communication, and personal growth. Keep learning, keep creating, and keep thinking differently.